August 17, 1944. 6:58 a.m. Camp Swift, Texas. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when the trucks rolled to a stop, kicking up thick clouds of red Texas dust that hung in the air like smoke. German POWs climbed down one by one, blinking against the bright light, expecting shouting guards, rifle barrels in their faces, and the harsh discipline they knew back home. But instead, they were met with something entirely different. A quiet breeze stirred the tall grass. Laundry lines stretched between wooden barracks. American guards leaned casually against fence posts, rifles slung over their shoulders, not aimed. And somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played, soft, slow, almost welcoming. The warmth of the morning sun fell across the camp, and for a moment, the Germans felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Unteroffizier Hans Keller wiped sweat from his brow and muttered to his friend Dieter, "This cannot be real. They are tricking us." But Dieter wasn't so sure. After months aboard a collapsing front in Italy, they'd grown used to hunger, exhaustion, and commanders who barked orders louder than artillery shells. Here, everything was calm, structured, almost gentle. A guard approached them, not with a baton or rage, but with a clipboard and a weary smile. "Breakfast first. Eggs, biscuits, sausage. Then we'll get you assigned. Don't worry, fellas, nobody's looking to rough you up." Hans frowned deeply. "Breakfast? For prisoners?" The guard shrugged. "Army regulations. You get what we get." Hans and Dieter exchanged a look, one of disbelief that bordered on suspicion. In Germany, recruits were drilled until they collapsed, fed watery soup, punished for breathing wrong. Here, they were being led to a mess hall that smelled like actual food. Inside, long tables were laid with metal trays, pitchers of cold water, baskets of bread. The American cooks worked behind the counter with casual efficiency, joking with each other, not even glancing at the POWs as if this were the most ordinary routine in the world. A Texan sergeant with a thick accent handed Hans his tray. "Eat up. Big day ahead." Hans stared down at scrambled eggs, real eggs, not powdered rations, and a warm biscuit. Dieter's jaw dropped. "Mein Gott, this is better than the army fed us." Hans didn't say it aloud, but he thought the same thing. As they sat at a table, a few German prisoners whispered among themselves. "This is propaganda. A trap. They will beat us after we eat." But nothing happened. No guards looming over them. No shouting. Just the clatter of trays and the low hum of conversation. One POW, an older Bavarian named Friedrich, finally broke the silence. "I think," he said slowly, "the Americans treat livestock worse than this." Dieter lifted his biscuit, still steaming. "Then what are we?" "Guests." Hans shook his head. "Prisoners, but prisoners they do not hate." Outside, the Texas morning grew brighter. A group of POWs walked freely, toward the camp garden, escorted by a single guard who didn't even bother to hold his rifle with both hands. Others carried lumber, tools, paint buckets. They were building things, fixing things, working like hired men, not chained captives. Hans watched with narrowing eyes. "If this were Germany," he whispered, "we would be beaten for walking too slowly." "And here?" Dieter asked. Hans looked around at the calm order of the camp, the workers laughing, the guards talking about baseball, the smell of coffee drifting from the open windows of the barracks. "Here," he said quietly, almost ashamed to admit it, "we are treated like human beings." But he had no idea that the real shock was still coming. Because later that afternoon, when Hans stepped into the camp canteen for the first time, he would witness something so unbelievable, so against everything he'd ever learned, that he would question everything he thought he knew about America and about Germany. The Texas sun hung high overhead when the guards waved Hans, Dieter, and a small group of POWs toward a squat wooden building near the center of camp. On the door, in bold English letters, was a sign Hans could barely translate. "Canteen. Open hours. 12 to 1800 hours." A canteen? For prisoners? Hans exchanged wary glances with the others. In Germany, soldiers didn't have canteens this nice, much less prisoners. Yet the Americans acted like this was normal, even routine. Inside, the room was cool and shaded, smelling faintly of wood polish and something sweet, something fruity. American guards lounged near the entrance but didn't shout, didn't bark orders. They simply nodded the prisoners in, as if inviting them into a shop rather than a controlled facility. Hans stepped forward slowly, and then he froze. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with books, stationery, shaving kits, postcards, Bibles, pocket dictionaries. On one side, a counter held candy bars, soda bottles packed in ice, tins of tobacco, and even magazines. Magazines with glossy covers showing smiling families, baseball players, and advertisements for automobiles. Hans blinked. Dieter's jaw literally dropped open. One of the younger POWs whispered, voice trembling, This looks like a civilian store." The clerk behind the counter, an army private barely older than them, smiled warmly. "Afternoon, fellas. You can browse whatever you like. Your camp script works here." "Camp script?" Hans frowned. We have money." The guard nodded. "You work, you earn. Basic pay. Same rules apply as for American enlisted men. Different rate, but fair." Hans felt his mind reel. Back home, German soldiers barely saw their pay. POWs? They wouldn't earn a single pfennig. They were lucky to get crusts of bread. Dieter stepped close to Hans and whispered, "Hans, look." He pointed to a handwritten sign above the counter. "POWs may purchase items freely. No guard permission needed." Freely? Hans felt something twist inside him. Confusion, mixed with something bittersweet, something he hadn't felt since before the war, dignity. A guard walked past, sipping a bottle of soda. "You boys finned in everything all right?" he asked. Hans stared at him, completely thrown off balance. Why do you give us these things?" The guard shrugged casually. "You're prisoners, not animals. Geneva rules are clear. And besides," he grinned, "a man who's treated decent works better than a man who's beat down." That last sentence hit Hans like a punch. In Germany, they never treated us like this. Not even their own men. A POW near the back, Otto, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, picked up an English dictionary and traced his finger along the pages like it was some kind of holy object. He turned to Karl, eyes glassy. "I have not held a book in months. They burned most of ours before the surrender." Another POW approached the counter timidly. "Do you have postcards?" The clerk motioned to a whole rack. "Take your pick." The German stared. "We may write to our families." The clerk shook his head with a smile. "Not may. Should. That's why we keep these stocked." Hans stood absolutely still. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't trickery. It was simply human decency. Something he had begun to believe did not exist in war. But the day wasn't done surprising him. A bell rang outside, signaling mealtime. POWs filed out. Hans and Dieter followed, still clutching the canteen's script vouchers. As they stepped into the afternoon light, they saw something that made them stop cold. American guards playing baseball with German prisoners. Laughing, joking, competing. Together. One guard tossed a bat to a POW. "Your turn, Kraut. Don't make excuses, swing like you mean it." The POW laughed and stepped to the plate. Hans felt his throat tighten. Back home, a German soldier wouldn't dare laugh with officers. Wouldn't dare speak freely. Wouldn't dare relax. Here, prisoners were treated better than enlisted men had been under certain German commanders. Dieter whispered, "In Germany, they would beat us for smiling." Hans nodded slowly. "And here they give us reasons to." He hadn't yet understood the full scale of the difference. But later that night, when an American medic opened the infirmary door to treat a feverish German POW with the same care he gave U.S. soldiers, Hans would finally realize just how deeply this kindness ran, and how painful that realization would become. By the time evening settled over Camp Swift, the Texas heat had softened into a warm, peach-colored glow. The smell of cut grass drifted across the compound, carried by a quiet breeze that rustled the barracks roofs. Most POWs were finishing dinner, meatloaf, potatoes, cornbread, far better than what many had eaten in uniform back home. Hans and Dieter walked slowly toward the barracks, still silent from everything they'd seen. Then a shout cut through the calm. "Medic! We need a medic, now." The POWs froze. A guard sprinted out of the infirmary, waving for help. Two Germans carried another prisoner, Otto, the Luftwaffe mechanic, between them. His face was pale, his eyes glassy, sweat pouring down his neck. He looked like he could barely breathe. Hans felt a jolt of fear. Back in Germany, a sick soldier was often seen as a burden. Complaints meant weakness. Treatment meant delays, paperwork, reprimands. Unless you were an officer, care was optional. But here, the guard opened the infirmary door with urgency, not anger. "Bring him in. Quickly, inside, the cool, white-painted room smelled of antiseptic and fresh linens. American medics moved instantly, checking Otto's pulse, feeling his forehead, lifting him gently onto a clean cot. One medic, a young corporal with rolled sleeves, spoke softly but firmly. He's burning up. Probably heat exhaustion mixed with dehydration. Get the saline. Another medic nodded and came back with an 4 bag. An 4. For a German prisoner. Hans stepped closer, his heart pounding. You treat us with this? This is for your own soldiers. The medic didn't even look up. Sick is sick. Doesn't matter the uniform. Now let me work. The words hit Hans harder than any beating ever could. Otto groaned weakly while the medics adjusted his pillow, wiped his face with a cool cloth, and checked his breathing. One of them even held a cup of water to his lips, telling him gently, easy small sips. Hans felt something crack inside him, something he'd held tight since the war began. He realized suddenly that compassion was not a weakness here. It was protocol, duty, something given without hesitation. Back home, officers often said mercy made a man soft. Here, mercy made the system strong. Dieter whispered, almost trembling, Hans, do you think the Americans hate us? Hans looked around the room, at the medics moving with practiced care, at the guards watching quietly, not with suspicion but concern, at Otto, treated not as the enemy but as a patient. No, Hans said softly. Maybe they hate what we fight for, but not us as men. They stood by Otto for nearly an hour as he stabilized, drifting into restful sleep. When the medics finally stepped back, one of them wiped his hands and turned to Hans. He'll be fine by morning. Get him fresh water and keep him cool. Hans swallowed hard. Why do you treat us like this? The medic sighed. Because someday this war will end. And if we're all still human at the end of it, we've done something right. Hans didn't know how to respond. No German officer had ever said anything like that. Not in training. Not in battle. Not ever. As they stepped outside into the cool Texas night, Hans and Dieter paused near the barbed wire fence, staring out at the dim fields stretching into the horizon. Fireflies blinked lazily in the grass. The peaceful hum of crickets filled the air. Dieter shook his head slowly. Hans, I cannot stop thinking about it. We were told the Americans were monsters, savages. He looked back at the softly glowing infirmary window. And yet, they treat us better than Germany treated its own soldiers. Hans closed his eyes. That, he said quietly, is the first thing in this war that truly frightens me. But the most startling shock was still waiting for them. One that would happen the very next day, when the Americans allowed the POWs to do something no German commander would have ever permitted. Earn trust and freedom at the same time. The next morning broke warm and bright, the Texas sun spilling over Camp Swift like liquid gold. Dew shimmered on the grass, boots clacked faintly on wooden porches, and the smell of breakfast drifted lazily through the humid air. Hans and Dieter walked toward roll call expecting another ordinary day. Light work, polite guards, and that strange, disarming calm that still felt unreal. But today was different. A group of American officers stood near the center of the yard with clipboards. The guards waved the POWs closer, not with force, but with purpose. One of the lieutenants, a broad-shouldered man with a soft Tennessee drawl, stepped forward. Listen up, fellas. Today we're starting voluntary work crews outside the wire. Farm work, carpentry, road repair. Anyone who wants to earn more scrip, more privileges, better meals, step forward. Outside the wire. Hans blinked. Dieter froze. The other Germans murmured like they'd misheard. One POW finally raised his hand shakily. You mean, unsupervised? The American officer chuckled. Supervised, sure. But lightly. And only to keep you safe. He tapped his clipboard. Plenty of POWs from other camps do this already. Some even help local farmers. Texans appreciate good hard work. Hans couldn't believe it. They were offering freedom. Partial, controlled, but freedom nonetheless. The Germans waited for the catch. A trick, a trap, a test. But the Americans weren't bluffing. The lieutenant pointed to the open gate at the far side of the camp. Open, not locked, not guarded by a machine gun nest. Just open. Step forward if you want the job, he called out. Silence. A tense, heavy silence. Then surprisingly, Friedrich, the oldest POW, who barely spoke the day before, walked across the yard. Calm, steady, unafraid. A few guards clapped. That's what I like to see. Within seconds, others followed. 10 POWs. 20. 30. Hans felt his legs move before his mind even agreed. Dieter grabbed his arm. Hans, are we fools? What if they shoot us? What if we step outside and... They won't, Hans said firmly, surprising even himself. If they wanted to hurt us, they had hundreds of chances. They joined the line. At the gate, the POWs were given work gloves, water canteens, and wide-brimmed hats to protect them from the sun. One guard even handed Dieter a piece of chalk and said, "If you get lost, mark the trail. We'll find you before sundown." Dieter stared at him. "You trust us, not to escape?" The guard shrugged with a smile. "Where would you go? Mexico? It's hotter there." The POWs laughed, actually laughed, and stepped out into the open Texas countryside. No barbed wire. No shouting. No dogs. Just open fields, dusty roads, and a few trucks waiting to take them to nearby farms. Hans paused at the gate. He turned around, staring back into the camp. The fences, the barracks, the American flag fluttering quietly in the warm breeze. For the first time, he felt something bizarre and unsettling. He didn't feel trapped. He felt safe. The truck rumbled forward, carrying Germans who had never known freedom without fear. They arrived at a sprawling ranch, where a sunburned Texan farmer greeted them with a nod. No insults, no suspicion, just practical kindness. "Glad you boys are here," the farmer said. "We've got hay to lift, fences to mend, and a whole lot of ground to cover. Work hard, and you'll eat like kings." The POWs stared at him, waiting for sarcasm. But after an hour of hauling bales, the farmer's wife appeared with pitchers of lemonade, cold, sweet, poured into real glasses. Hans held his drink and stared into it, as if it were a hallucination. "This is better than our officers treated us," he whispered. "Better than our own country ever treated us." Dieter nodded, looking out across the open fields. When this war ends," he said softly, "I don't know what waits for us at home. But I know this." He pointed at the rancher's family smiling at the POWs, including the children who waved shyly. "I will never forget that my enemy showed me more humanity than my leaders did." Hans took a deep, unsteady breath. For the first time since the war began, he felt a strange warmth inside. Not fear, not pride, but something gentler. Something dangerously close to peace. And at that moment, he realized the truth. Germany had lost more than the war. It had lost its soul. But here, on Texas soil, treated like men instead of machines, the POWs rediscovered theirs.